What up, y'all? I'm back, and this time I want to discuss something that pertains to an ongoing experience that I'm still struggling with at present, but that also pertains to the society in which I live across the whole continent of North America and perhaps other parts of the world as well. I'm referring to the epidemic in opioid addiction and overdoses that I've been hearing so much about in the news for several years now, primarily in the United States, but also to an extent in my native Canada. Last year, 2016, as I'm sure we all know, was a very bad year for celebrities, a year of a number of prominent celebrity deaths. My favorite musician, Prince, was claimed by one of those deaths. His death owed to an overdose, if I'm not mistaken, of fentanyl, a powerful painkiller. I think Prince's autopsy revealed that he had been taking painkillers for years, if not decades, to treat pain that he suffered due to years of enthusiastic stage dancing during his performances, especially given the fact that he wore 4-inch stiletto heels to do it. I always marveled at his ability to bust a split in 4-inch stiletto heels. I guess that came with a price. Got to pay a cost to be a boss. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because this is an issue that I'm hearing a lot about, even in pop culture. One of my favorite shows, one of the few shows that I follow nowadays on TV, the few non-reality shows that I follow, is Empire. One of their story arcs this season has been the struggle of Jamal Lyon, played by Jussie Smollett, with a painkiller dependency. After he was shot at the end of last season, he's been struggling to get off of painkillers this whole fall, and the fall segment of the season ended with his family staging an intervention right after he came off his stage from a performance and getting him into rehab. Now, I watched that scene and thought to myself, that really fits a pattern. I was reading an article around that same time about a married couple in British Columbia, Canada's westernmost province, just north of Washington State. A married couple who, for different reasons, both got hooked on opioid painkillers and ended up overdosing fatally on fentanyl and a couple of other medications. You can find a link to the article in which I read that story underneath this video. Now, I read that story and I saw that I think the first doctor or one of the first doctors they saw told the husband to his face, I'm not going to be one of those doctors who just keep on writing you prescriptions. At some point, I'm going to have to cut you off. Now, I think that doctor made good on the threat, but they found another doctor who was a lot more accommodating. And it brought back so many memories for me. Exactly 1 year ago, I got my left knee totally replaced. That's right. I underwent a total knee replacement at the age of 30. Long story. Now, that happened pursuant to a knee injury to both my knees actually, that I suffered 3.5 years ago. And I've been dealing with it ever since. The problems with my left knee in particular stemmed from a botched surgery, from which I'm still trying to get satisfaction, by the way, about 2.5 years ago. Now, that injury caused me some of the worst pain I've ever felt in my life, and in order to deal with it, I was put on not one, but 2 different painkillers. Now, in the past 2.5 years, I've undergone 4 different knee surgeries, 3 of them major knee surgeries in 2 different countries, Canada and the United States, Washington, D.C., and my hometown of Montreal. The middle 2 of those surgeries were performed by a doctor, an orthopedic surgeon in Washington, D.C., and he told me from the very first time I met him that he's a real stickler when it comes to prescribing painkillers. He said he wasn't going to prescribe me any opiates because he didn't want me to become dependent on them. Instead, he prescribed me a non-opiate painkiller that did absolutely nothing for me. So I actually had to rely on a hematologist I was seeing who was following me throughout that whole process, and she actually wrote me the prescriptions that I needed for the painkillers that I really needed, the only ones that were strong enough to handle the level of pain that I was experiencing. And let me tell you, I was in and out of the hospital for weeks, even months on end. Ultimately, it cost me my job, my U.S. work permit, forced me to move back to Canada almost 2 years ago. Since returning to Montreal, I've gone through the Canadian healthcare system, specifically the Quebec healthcare system, and ultimately had my left knee replaced completely exactly a year ago. Through all of that, I have been dependent on some pretty strong painkillers. My doctor here in Montreal referred me to a specialist here who actually has been working with me throughout the whole second half of 2016 up to the present to wean me off of that painkiller dependency little by little in stages. It hasn't been easy. There have been a lot of bumps and setbacks along the way, but overall, I've made steady progress. And I'm very blessed and fortunate to have been able to have that resource, especially when I keep reading in the news and even seeing in fictional television shows and the like, all of these stories of people who've been through experiences fundamentally similar to mine, but who turned out much worse. I remember reading an article not too long ago, after the election, in which I think it was Politico. They interviewed a number of working class rural white folks who voted for Trump in the heartland of the United States. And I remember there were so many stories about people, particularly young people, who had become hooked on first prescription painkillers and eventually hard drugs like heroin in order to deal with their pain. It almost always started with run-of-the-mill injuries that led further down the road to full-blown opiate addiction and unfortunately often to overdoses, lethal overdoses in many cases. I remember reading one story in that Politico article about a young man who played football in high school, and because of all the running involved, he got sore knees, was prescribed painkillers for the sore knees, and eventually when his doctor cut him off, he simply went out on the street and scored heroin, and eventually he died of an overdose. And I remember thinking, it's amazing. I had an injury to both of my knees. I had sore knees for a different reason, but still, sore knees. My left knee ended up a lot more than just sore. I ended up on some pretty strong painkillers. Fortunately, I had doctors who understood, not that doctor, the surgeon who performed my middle two surgeries, but other than him, I had doctors who understood that prescribing weak non-opiate painkillers simply wasn't a viable option for me, and who also understood that simply cutting me off abruptly and forcing me to quit cold turkey wasn't a viable option either. But most importantly, I had the option of being treated by a doctor like the toxicologist I'm currently seeing, who knows the right technique to wean me off the painkiller dependency. And it's remarkable to me that that kind of resource isn't more widely available in both Canada and the United States. So during my last interview with my doctor, just last week, I asked her, what gives? It seems pretty plain to me that the kind of resource that these patients out there need is the resource that you represent for me. Are there not that many other doctors out there like you? And my doctor told me, actually, no, there actually aren't that many of them. Now, there are plenty of doctors out there who specialize in pain management and so on, but when it comes to the particular task of weaning people off of painkiller dependencies without their having to go into rehab, like Jussie Smollett's character Jamal Lyon on Empire, actually, there's a shortage of doctors in that particular field. My doctor told me, and I mind you, she was speaking from the perspective of a Canadian doctor and in the Quebec healthcare system to be precise. She told me that actually what she does is basically sort of a charitable endeavor. She mainly works in emergency rooms, but she spends one day a week working in a clinic where I see her and other patients in my position work with her. And she doesn't get paid much for it. She's basically doing it out of the goodness of her heart. She told me that a lot of patients in my position aren't as easy to work with as I am. A lot of them are folks with psychological problems and dependency on more than one drug, not just prescription drugs. And so working with these patients is really stressful and difficult. It seemed to me that doctors like her are needed. This is a niche that more medical students and doctors who are already in practice should consider going into. But if the task really is as difficult as my doctor made it out to be, then maybe they need some kind of incentive. I'm not a healthcare policy expert. Wouldn't pretend to be. Now, I do have a lot of experience with both the US and Canadian healthcare systems, which frankly I could have done without and would have preferred to do without, but here I am. When it comes to healthcare reform efforts, particularly in the United States, where the incoming Trump administration and the incoming Republican Congress are set to reopen the whole debate and try to repeal Obamacare, whether in whole or in part, it seems to me that a conversation about the opioid epidemic and how to deal with it and how to treat it effectively has to be part of the conversation. There needs to be a concerted effort in the public and private spheres to address this problem by creating incentives for more doctors to be willing to provide this kind of service. A person in my position shouldn't need to go into rehab, Narcotics Anonymous, or the like in order to kick a painkiller dependency. There are ways to do it without a person having to disrupt their lives to that degree. I'm living proof of that. I'm going through just such a procedure as we speak. So I have this message to send to healthcare public policy makers on both sides of the 49th parallel in Canada and the United States. That is an issue that definitely needs to be very much on the table. By whatever tools, policy tools are available in the different countries, in the various states and provinces, something has to be done about this. I remember hearing throughout this past election campaign in the US over and over again how so many working class white folks in the hinterlands of America were turning to Trump for their political salvation, partly because of all the challenges they were going through, social, economic challenges, one of which was the opioid addiction and overdose epidemic. So if the incoming president really thinks that he is the best candidate to deal with the problems of these people, to help solve the problems of the forgotten people, as he called them on the campaign trail, then now is the time for him to put his money, or rather taxpayers' money, where his mouth has been for the past year and a half or so. Now is the time for you to walk your talk and do something, or at least make it easier for others, perhaps in the private sector, to do something to address the opioid epidemic. There has to be some way of making the kind of service, the kind of treatment that I'm currently getting available to all those folks out there in so-called Trump land, as I like to call it, who are suffering from the opioid epidemic. Simply cracking down on drugs through the war on drugs is counterproductive. In much the same way that alcohol prohibition was counterproductive, drug prohibition is counterproductive now. What we need is to make resources available to folks so that they can kick these painkiller dependencies without any sense of shame, without any sense of stigma or opprobrium or disapproval. At no point has anyone made me feel like I had anything to be ashamed of because of the dependency that I've had on prescription painkillers. I've made huge progress. My dosage levels are way down from where they were back in the last spring, when I first started working with this latest doctor. So there is hope. It can be done. I would very much like to hear from anyone who would be willing to discuss their experiences with me, particularly your experiences dealing with doctors. Too many doctors are too accommodating and are willing to just keep writing scripts for painkillers, and too many other doctors are far too hard-assed and insist on cutting you off at a certain point, or like my second knee surgeon, not even writing you prescriptions for the right kinds of medication at all in the first place. Both of those approaches are too extreme. Neither approach is going to work adequately. Certain people with certain injuries who are in certain kinds and levels of pain need these strong painkillers in order to have any kind of quality of life. But at the same time, of course, simply allowing them, keeping them on these painkillers in perpetuity is no solution either. Now, in my case, I was able to start working with a doctor who could help me wean myself off the painkillers because I was able to have my knee replacement surgery done after struggling with this knee injury issue for, I guess at that point, about a year and a half. I was finally able to have that surgery done, which dealt with the fundamental causes of the pain. I was able to graduate to the weaning off phase because I was able to get treatment for the underlying condition. Not everyone can say that, unfortunately. But for those of us who can say that, who are blessed enough to have that treatment of the underlying root causes of our conditions, it's a different story. Folks in those positions at least should be able to benefit from medical help from professionals who take the right approach. Not cutting them off and forcing them to quit cold turkey, but at the same time, not keeping them on the hook in perpetuity. There need to be more doctors out there like my current doctor who can help folks with this particular challenge. So, Mr. Trump, step up. Folks in Congress, both houses, House and Senate, step up. Public policymakers at the state level, step up. And here in Canada, public policymakers in all 10 provinces and all 3 territories, step up. This is a serious problem. It needs to be dealt with. It's taken several of our shining stars. It's taken a lot of ordinary folks, the forgotten folks Trump was talking about on the campaign trail. Something needs to be done. I just hope y'all wake up and heed the call.